What does the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada say when the government of the day makes a pronouncement that they wish to downsize the public service?
Well, public servants are in a particularly onerous position that we've seen this ebb and flow over, I guess it happens over the last centuries, or as long as we've been in Federation. It's part of the union's role, our role, to question, I guess, whether these are the right moves. At the end of the day, the government is going to legislate and do what it wants. We come back to the fundamentals that our members are our members' particular case, are really the knowledge workers, of the country. There's scientists. We represent all the scientists in the federal public service, highly qualified people that the government needs to rely on to get the best advice to run the country, make the best decisions, the best policy decisions for the country. And sometimes those policy decisions don't jive when you talk about the workforce. So we perform the necessary challenge function to that. Sometimes in the media, all the time at the bargaining table.
What have you found to be most effective? Is that the bargaining table, or is it lobbying? Is it going public? Is it a media campaign? What is effective to push back on those kinds of broad statements and decisions?
All of the above work, some more so than others, and some it's hard to judge the effectiveness of it. I mean, the voting public is, for example, you see, and there's a lot of conjecture and there's a lot of spin put in this. For example, you see that in recent press, they call me a union boss. I don't know if you know that. And there's other union bosses. The whole language changes, and it becomes a matter of discrediting the source rather than dealing with the issue on the table, which is, could be pensions, could be sick leave. So it's an interesting dynamic, and we're still learning. What works best? You have to go with what works now, I think.
But we've seen in the United States, in some of the states in the United States, the decertification of various unions at state levels, those that are providing public services. And we're starting to see creeping into Canada a philosophy that, well, instead of having members of the public service do it, we'll just contract out. Yeah. We really don't need all these engineers. We don't need these nurses. And how do you counteract that?
It's very difficult. Public education, trying to do research with, proving cases that where they entered into P3 relationships or where they contracted out, it actually cost more money. A lot of press in terms of what the role of the public services versus the role of a private enterprise. Let me give you an example. Recently we had well-documented issue around the experimental lakes, the closure of the experimental lakes region where my scientist members worked. They closed that down. The government saved $1 million a year, but they lost the capacity that has been there for 40 years to study the environment in an open. And I'm not criticizing the government. It just happened. It's an actual fact. So one of the things, the public is aware of that. So that's what public scientists do. They're paid for by the public to do that. So making the public aware of that, making other stakeholders aware of that is our role. And actually some of those decisions made by this government or other governments come under the scrutiny of the international community. Why would you do that? The difference is between, I guess, ideological reasons or reasons of evidence.
But I think we're seeing two strands here. One is the actual negotiations that you do at the table with Treasury Board and those respective officials. But there's a broader issue here in terms of the advocacy that you have to play, your organization is playing with regards to the benefits that a well-educated public service can bring to the delivery of good services to the people. Am I right in that?
Yeah, we do. You're right. We do both of those things. They are connected, especially when you are a representative in the public service, when you represent scientists or IT professionals where they're needed to run the public service. I think those two are very much connected.
Must be challenging, though, in terms of trying to address that side, because it obviously would impact the negotiations.
Yeah, it's if we make the case well enough, because obviously the politicians, I mean, right now, and in the last budget, you're talking about balancing the budget and fiscal restraint, and all that is true. All that is very true, that Minister Flaherty has, and this government have issues on their hands. But at the same time, there are decisions that are going to be made that are going to be affecting, I have 60,000 members, there's 250,000 workers in the public service that affect those, so it becomes labor issues as well. So they are very much intertwined, and it's very difficult to balance those. And
as part of your advocacy, have you joined with other organizations to try to push back on some of these issues?
Yep. Absolutely. We work with an organization called the National Joint Council, which is a council of unions who do collective bargaining in the public service, and there's about 18 bargaining agents.
Sort of like a coalition of different entities.
But it's a success because it was formed in 1946, and combined they represent a huge percentage of the public service, and they have moved stuff out of the bargaining realm for each union and put it in under an umbrella. For example, things that were bargained, like isolated post allowances and travel directives, put in directives, very successful. That's one area that we've really seen success over the last number of years. We've also joined most recently with the Canadian Labour Congress. We did. That's 3 million workers in the country. Although we're public workers, there are some others in the CLC. And we also create other coalitions. One recently is called Professional Serving Canadians, which was a subset of the NJC. All of the financial officers in the Government of Canada, for example. We also have international connections with other public sector unions in the UK, in Australia, in Europe. So it's, and tracking changes in the labor market globally.
As the president of a union, an institute, the Public Service of Canada, tell us about listening and listening skills. Obviously, a lot of listening in terms of your own members, some listening, I would think, in terms of dealing with Treasury Board and senior officials and ministers of the day. A skill you've acquired? Is it an important thing?
Well, a skill that certainly, if I hadn't acquired, I probably wouldn't be where I am. It's, somebody said to me one time that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. That should give you a clue of what you should do. Listen as much as you talk, or twice as much. So extremely important. Not only with the ears, but you need to watch body language. You need all of the communication. Somebody said also that 90% of the communication is nonverbal. So yeah, definitely you need to do that of your members, of everything around you to set the environment for bargaining, to give you a sense of where you need to go in the bargaining, in the bargaining environment.
Has that been an acquired skill that you've been able to develop in your tenure? Is something that you have to work on?
Oh, it never ends. It never ends. And yes, you have to develop it in your tenure. And because it's somebody said to me, you can learn by your own mistakes, or you can learn by somebody else's. So you have to observe too, because it's always better to learn from somebody else's. And so when you get off that tone, when you don't listen, you need to yank yourself back and say, oh, I didn't listen there. There's something I missed. And so definitely it's a huge skill.
And have you found that the other side are good listeners?
Well, my gut says no, but then that would be my gut. you have to believe that they're listening. I think that you have to go in with an honest approach that if you want to achieve something together, you have to believe that the other side is listening as much as you. So sometimes you don't feel that way, but I think if you really want to move to the objective of getting to the end, to an agreement, there's a lot of trust there, and so you have to put that out. Yes.
Do you utilize the probing questions to find out what's behind the position of the other side, and indeed probing your own members in terms of their particular stated objective? Do you use that as a technique?
You have to use that technique. Somebody also said trust but verify. Like I trust, so you have to go back and say, well, I want to verify this. This is my view of it. Is that right? Is that wrong? What are your thoughts on that? Definitely, the probing technique is fundamental because you're going to be verifying what you've heard to a certain
Any
extent.
examples come to mind where you've probed for the purposes of getting verification on a particular matter, subject matter?
Not off the top of my head, probably because it's used so often. There's so many examples. I can't pick one out.
Are you the only one as the member of your team that does the probing, or are there others on your team in the negotiation that does some of the probing?
Well, the way it works, the mechanics of it, usually there's a table, there's the employer and the employee. There's usually a named person that's at the front of the team who will speak to the other named person at the front of that team. And at times when there becomes an impasse, they will break out and go into their own caucus where there will be discussion about these probing questions that need to be asked. Come back together, the probing questions are asked, the answers are shared. You might have one person that's asking the question, but you have 10 or 12 people behind who are watching the body language of the others and listening to the answers. Break out in caucus again. What did you learn? Come back, and it happens that way. So, yeah, the probing technique is used, but it's usually agreed what comes at where you want to ask the questions. It's not as off the cuff as people think.
Tell me, you reference caucus. Do you caucus a lot in terms of your negotiations?
Yes, we do. When you're at the table and you've set down your list, your wish list, and the other side is giving you we call them demands, and the other side is giving you their positions. From that point on, it's a matter of in and out and caucusing. Are we willing to accept this? Does this meet our mandate? Can we find a way to achieve some movement? And then it's back in again with the other side, sharing demands, agreeing to things, to the end where you finally come to some kind of agreement on what you can agree to on paper.
So I take it from your intervention here is that the caucusing takes place relatively often during the process. It just wouldn't be one occurrence.
No, sometimes these bargainings, like especially with my members, sometimes the bargaining takes place over months. So people would come in, they would have a meeting, and the meetings could go for days. The agreements could be reached at 2 or 3 in the morning. But that process includes my team breaking away, their team breaking away to discuss caucuses at caucus to discuss issues that may have been pinch points. Yeah, that can occur.
Is patience a quality that a negotiator needs in great abundance, or is it an overused word?
Well, I mean, the older I get, I think the more value patience has. Absolutely. Absolutely, it's something that needs to be front and center on every negotiator's mind. Don't go too quick. Listen and be patient. Yeah, absolutely. Don't try to rush the process, I would say.
Do you find that the other side would like to rush the process, or are they as patient as you and members of your team?
Well, it's a tactic sometimes too, right? Like, to rush the other side is a tactic. For example, something appears in the paper, and people on either side might want to seize the moment and say, well, and I'm across from you and saying, well, this is in the paper now, and I kind of got you at the moment because it looks like the wind has shifted a certain direction, but it might be momentary. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. In the bargaining process, there are a lot of toing and froing, and there are a lot of arguments put why you should not have something or you should have something. And sometimes that becomes a momentary thing, especially in public service where, as you know, it's very political and something appears in the press. And so patience is extremely important there, and to transcend those peaks and valleys.
You've mentioned the press and the media. What role does that play in your stewardship of President and CEO of the Professional Institute of the Public Service? How do you deal with the media, and how do they deal with you on some of your issues?
I actually like working with the press. I see them as a vehicle that tries to report a certain perspective, an honest perspective. I mean, you hear about the honest story. Will we use the press in bargaining? I would say that I wouldn't go there in terms of trying to use the press for bargaining. Like, go out of my way to call a reporter, and I have good relationships with reporters. Call them, I need you to report this for me. That's not so much. When will they call me, and will I give our views? Most certainly, but not in a way that I would aggressively try to promote our views. I don't believe in bargaining in the public.
But if we were to jump from the actual negotiating table into your role as an advocate, would you not be using the media there?
Well, as much as the other side might be, but from a point of view of a different stakeholder, I suppose. I mean, in the public service, obviously knows that the taxpayers pay the salary of to a certain extent, it could be argued the taxpayers pay my member's salary. So they are the stakeholders, and they are concerned. I mean, we see that when things like sick leave come up. So to the certain extent where those issues are questioned, I have a feeling that I have to defend those for the purpose of bargaining or representation.
Tell us, either by example or experience, about your association dealing with Treasury Board. How do you put the agenda together for your first meeting? You have a collective agreement, the agreement is up, you have to renegotiate one, you're coming together. What's the agenda? How do you develop that agenda?
Now, the negotiators, we have professional negotiators who will work with professional negotiators in Treasury Board. They principally work together at that level to develop the agenda. May dabble in some of the general discussion around the issues, what's the priority of the issues. Before the bargaining teams ever get together, there may be some positioning. An interesting one in the last number of years was the severance piece with the Federal Public Service. And we knew the position kind of before we got to the bargaining table, because the negotiators talk, the government makes statements, budget comes up, So we kind of know where it's going. So that forms the kernel of the agenda from which the negotiators will get together and finalize their issues, priority of issues. On the management side, I mean, the way it works in Treasury Board is they have managers from various departments and agencies. So there's that dynamic as well. Some represent scientists, some represent IT, for example. And maybe the position of this government is that they want to focus on science. And there's only so much money, so there has to be a decision where the focus will be, where they're going to augment wages of some classes and not of others.
But I want to come back to the agenda. You have staff
Yes.
with the Institute. Treasury Board has staff. They get together. They have a discussion. They know and I'm just going to use
the rough
10 or 12 items that are going to be on the agenda. Mm-hmm. Then it's shot back to you as the political operative and the president and CEO. and then the senior people on Treasury Board. So when you sit down at that first meeting, has that agenda changed appreciably from what staff has been able to put together?
Well, I mean, the bargaining function is principally done by the staff. I mean, rarely do I actually get called in until we're in like the short strokes. You know, it happens where even where we're closer to impasse, where it kind of seems closer to impasse, and someone wants to bring in the heavier guns or whatever to try to deal with senior levels of government. That's the way it happens. The agenda between the Treasury Board and my staff happens at a certain level. I have a manager of negotiations who has negotiators under him, and I have 3 people that are above that. But I am informed, and we do make some strategic decisions, but at that level, that's mostly done at the staff level with the input of membership.
But you do have a role to play in terms of the strategic items that are on that agenda to go forward.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't allow agenda to go forward if it didn't have your strategic
Correct.
objectives.
Correct. And one of the things we do on that is hold conferences of our membership, our entire membership, which is very diverse, and try to define the strategic direction. For example, when the government a few years ago, or last year, talked about removing severance, that was an item that impacted the entire membership. So our entire membership was kind of involved in that strategic
And how
piece.
were they involved? Did you call them on the phone? Did you Skype call?
We held a bargaining conference, and we had 100 people, roughly 150 people in it, come, and a 2-day event where these elected group executives would come in, discuss it, and whether they were willing to give up severance, and give up as a word as opposed to bargain. You know, we get into that kind of thing. Are you willing to bargain it? Other organizations, unions might say, we'll never do this, you know, positioning themselves. And some might say, well, you know, it was bargained before, and maybe it's a cost, and we're willing to bargain it. So it all depends on your approach and what the optic will be to the other side.
Does your association develop a concession strategy in advance of actually sitting down with Treasury Board officials and staff for the purposes of negotiation?
You know, I think you asked me that earlier. I'd have to say I don't think we do well enough at that. We should. Our concession strategy tends to be, you know, if we've got 20 items, what's the priority? So which ones are we willing to concede on to get to where we want to get to for the higher priority items? So that's a lot of that is we don't do that as a global strategy, but I think that's done at the group level, at the bargaining level, where they would prioritize items, and here's one we willing to drop here, you know. So, and there are times when you need to consider the environment as well in terms of whether it's the right time for concessions. So,
any examples come to mind where you've made concessions and it was good for the purposes of getting an agreement, or vice versa, where you made concessions and you didn't achieve your particular objective?
Well, I mean, what comes to mind most quickly is this severance thing that we've been dealing with over the last number of years. It was better for some of our groups than it was for others. There was no way. There was a way in some cases for some groups to put a monetary value on it, and at the end of the day, sometimes that's really how people measure things, unfortunately. But for other groups, there wasn't a way to put a monetary value on it, and but there was another kind of value, you know. Whether it was being able to not call this item terminable anymore and it be rolled into regular part of salary. Same money, but now it's called something different, and it's part of pension, for example. You know, that's important to realize there.
Has the negotiating process changed since you've come on the scene? I mean, you've been involved for a good number of years. Have you seen changes along the way, positive or negative?
Well, I think, you know, as I've been involved at the negotiating table, not so much anymore, at the more senior level now, the whole information technology, boom, the press, the fact that information moves at the speed of light. You find people that can text stuff, verify information very quickly. Once upon a time, you couldn't do that. You know, there wasn't a facility to emails, and maybe I'm dating myself. But it's changed that way. It's become more rapid. It's become more on my members' part. I think they want an agreement quicker. They want to know why something happened quicker. I don't think I'm speaking only about bargaining. I think that's just a general way the world is. People want something a lot quicker now and bargaining is not an exception.
But with the new technology, it must also provide an advantage for someone who has such a big membership of almost 60,000 professionals in their institute. With the new technology, you can get the information from them quicker, you can engage them perhaps a little quicker, you can be a little bit more thoughtful in terms of getting written position papers out to them. That must be helpful in some ways.
It is, but you got to remember, if I've got one group with, I mean, it's like there are good things, there are bad things, right, that come with every new development. And if the member is more engaged now, the member at the base, if they get involved in the survey, they do the survey, they also have the ability to flip me an email, say, oh, what's going on with my negotiation? And I think that's a point of access that
Never existed before.
Not before, no. And I can kick it to my negotiator and say, answer this. But then you're busy answering a lot of maybe email instead of actually negotiating. You know, there's only so much time the person has to. So there are good things, there are bad things. It's more open, transparent for us, but at the same time, it's a hell of a lot of work.
Now, we've reviewed your resume pretty extensively. We've seen you in operation. We've read the media clips on Gary Corbet as the president and CEO. But as you sit back and look at the negotiating process, what are some of the more important qualities that you think are necessary to be a good negotiator?
I think you have to have the trust of the other side. You have to have at least the trust that you're a consummate professional trying to negotiate a deal for a common, that everybody can live with. I think it pays to be a professional. I think it's important to listen, to show respect to the other side. Just to be on the same level, you know, you don't really want to, if you're going to work with somebody, you want that, respect is the most important element.
So, trustworthiness, respect, ability to listen.
Absolutely, yeah. Those qualities.
Final question.
Sure.
Planning. How much planning do you do as it relates to the negotiating process? Is that a big part of your activities in the organization as you plan for negotiations?
Well, somebody said he who fails to plan plans to fail. So absolutely, we're starting planning now for negotiation that will occur in 2014, late 2014. And that means bargaining conferences, that means talking to the employer, that means preparing for the surveys, that means talking to the membership. It's huge. It's huge. You can't just show up one day and say, I want this, and the other side says, I want that, and expect to get anywhere. I mean, you need to, and we're an organization of 60,000, so with 140 staff and 20 negotiators, and you know, you got to organize all these people, and yeah, you have to plan it.
It's a big piece of work.
It's huge, and you know, like it's hard to explain in a moment or two. It's huge. It's a huge piece of work.
In closing, anything you'd like to share with the students who may be watching our program or who are in a negotiating class? Any suggestions that you could offer them in terms of their own individual careers and associations?
Well, you know, I read something once that said, you don't get what you deserve. You get what you negotiate. I think that's and negotiation has been going on long before there was unions, I might add. So it's a skill that will help people in their day-to-day life with a one-on-one or whether it's as a union president. So I'll close there.
Good. Well, Gary, on behalf of the students at Ryerson University and the Ted Rogers School of Management, I want to express to you our appreciation for joining us today on the Ryerson Negotiation Project. We found your insights and your observations with regards to the negotiating process to be very helpful. And on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you.